Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. In this episode, I thought I would outline my living mirror theory of consciousness for you all. So, this theory is forthcoming in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and I submitted it there last year, 2019. It's undergone peer review and will be out around autumn of 2020 if you want to read the actual article. And I submitted it to the Journal of Consciousness Studies because there was a very influential paper that came out there in the 90s by a very important philosopher called David Chalmers. And this paper was on the hard problem of consciousness, as he called it. So he was basically breathing new life into the kind of what you might call the mind-body problem, the issue of how it is that the mind, consciousness, or this seemingly non-physical stuff relates to the kind of physical world. And the hard problem comes out of this kind of distinction he was making between what might be considered the easy problems of kind of physiology and in neuroscience. You know, if you're interested in visual consciousness, how is it that light gets transduced into electrical energy in the retina and then relayed to the brain? All these kinds of questions are studyable by the traditional scientific methods because, you know, the brain's a physical object and we can all study it. But when it comes to this question of how it is that all of that physical stuff gives us this appearance of a world, this kind of qualitative character of consciousness, well, he was arguing that's the real hard problem. And hard in a way that there may not even be a solution was the kind of implication. And he ended up playing around with the idea that it might be so hard because we're not thinking about it the right way, and perhaps consciousness is fundamental. And so actually the assumption that it emerges from biology, which is kind of the assumption of most neuroscientists, that assumption maybe is wrong. These kinds of ideas are getting a lot of traction at the moment. I'm not in that camp. I take the kind of the mainstream view that consciousness is an emergent feature of our reality, in the sense that you have physics and then chemistry emerges from physics, biology emerges from chemistry, and it seems to me that the mind is very much dependent on biological processes. You know, if you doubt this, think about if you were to lose an eye, you can be pretty sure that's going to impact your visual consciousness. And I can't think about this in any other way than the idea that things like eyes and brains are really crucial for visual consciousness in this case. So you have this problem of how it is that in a quantitative universe, in a universe made of measurable stuff that, you know, is in the domain of physics, all the stuff that people can quantify and write equations about and laws, you know, all that mathematics that fits to the kind of the quantitative natural world. How is it that physical, material, quantitative world gives rise to qualitative experience? And that's what we're talking about with consciousness. We're not talking about self-consciousness. We're not talking about cognition like thinking. What we're talking about is experience. So things like the experience of red, smells, feelings, you know, all of these things they're not quantities, right? Red isn't a quantity, it's a quality. And so the question really is, where in nature does consciousness emerge? Is it there right at the beginning? Does it emerge through some incredibly complex process in you know, our big human brains, which is the way that a lot of neuroscientists think about it, or at least in kind of mammalian brains? Or is it happening somewhere in the middle? And it's often posed that the kind of the hardness of the hard problem is that there's nothing you could say about the operation of a brain in third-person objective terms that would get you the fact that there's any kind of qualitative experience going on. So this paper came out a few years after one of the kind of pioneering theories of consciousness by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, who came up with this idea that neurons in the brain kind of synchronously activating 40 times a second roughly, that's the kind of the mechanism that generates consciousness, because there was a kind of association between consciousness and this kind of activity, a correlation between the two. So what David Chalmers was pointing out was that there's a kind of a magic trick, really. There's a kind of statement of a miracle happening in the gap between the 40 hertz oscillation and the kind of experience of red. That's not the kind of explanation we want in science. If you explain why it is that water flows, the fact that at the scale of individual molecules, they have kind of weak bonds and they tumble over each other, that's an intuitive explanation as to why water flows at certain temperatures. And then the fact that they kind of get bound rigidly together at cold temperatures, that's a kind of intuitive explanation as to why we have ice, right? So this is a kind of to give you a feeling of the hard problem. And it's usually stated in terms of, it's kind of taken for granted that it's something about the brain. It's like, what can we say is going on inside the brain that gives rise to this? Because there's such a strong correlation between brain activity and consciousness. And as I mentioned earlier, like physical injury to things like eyes and, in the case of visual consciousness, but damage to the brain, we know dramatically alters consciousness. Drugs that affect the brain alter consciousness. So most people are thinking, what is it about the brain that gives rise to consciousness? And another way this is often stated is, where in evolution did consciousness emerge? You go from, the kind of assumption is you go from blind mechanism, and at some point those kind of blind robots of living creatures have the lights turned on, and they have this experience of a world appearing around them. So back at the beginning of 2019, I wasn't thinking about this problem in particular, but I was thinking about a related problem, which is, how is it that in a universe that's fundamentally kind of a single thing, how is it that you can get separate, private, conscious experiences in different systems like you and me in that universe? And so what I mean by that is, if you look at the physical world, especially at the level of subatomic particles, at the level of quantum physics, it's very clear that rather than being constituted of separate individual things that kind of bump into each other, this is the kind of Newtonian worldview, where you have kind of billiard balls knocking into each other. And you can imagine the universe in that case being like a kind of pile of sand or something. It's made of these separate grains that can interact, but they're fundamentally separate. What we can see at the subatomic level is reality is far more like a kind of interwoven tapestry, where every point is dependent on all the other points. It's a fundamentally kind of holistic picture. It shows you that the universe really is a whole, rather than being made of separate things. And so given that the entire universe is a single thing, what's going on inside that structure that gives rise to private conscious experiences? And so I was reflecting on this, and the kind of solution I saw, I did see it. It kind of came to me as a visual intuition rather than a kind of set of linguistic propositions. But the kind of answer I saw was that when life forms, what happens is the universe kind of folds in on itself and creates bubbles, effectively, creates three-dimensional forms made out of the same stuff as the rest of the universe. That's what I mean when I say it folds in on itself. I'm using that to kind of conjure up an image rather than, that's not a precise thing in physics. But you can imagine, this process of bits of reality, of physical reality, coming together in a way that reality has now created a bubble, a three-dimensional structure. Think of a single-celled organism with a membrane. And it's the same for us. We developed from single-celled organisms. They got together into these colonies and made multicellular organisms because that was better for survival, or another strategy for survival rather than better. And so we're still these kind of three-dimensional enclosed structures. That's what I mean by a bubble. We're kind of strangely shaped bubbles. But with life, fundamentally, the universe closes in on itself in a way that makes this 3D structure. And I felt that must have something to do with the privacy. And very quickly I kind of realized, well, if that's something to do with the privacy of consciousness, maybe that's to do with where consciousness comes into existence. And what I reflected on was that in order for a system like ourselves, or a single-celled organism, or a plant, or any living system, in order for them to exist over time, they have to actively engage with the world around them. So it looks to us like bricks and rocks and plants are just kind of inert and they just kind of stay there. But there's a real difference between living things and non-living things. Even though it looks to us like plants are just pretty static, they actually, to be alive, they're actually kind of actively keeping their form together. So the universe is governed by something called the second law of thermodynamics, which states that what's called the entropy, which is a very precise kind of quantity in kind of thermodynamics, but you can think of it here as disorder, roughly. The entropy or disorder of the universe will increase over time. And there's no kind of magic to this law. It just happens because there are so many more ways for things to be disordered than ordered. So think about, if you have a tidy office, over time as things get moved around, it's going to get untidy. It's far less likely it's going to magically end up with all the books piled up neatly if you didn't intend it to be that way, right? It's just, as things move, there are many more ways for things to be messy. And so our universe moves towards kind of disorder and messiness. And this is tied up with the idea that it's all one system. If you think of a rock in the ocean, to us, we apply labels and concepts to that. And we say the rock is different to the ocean. But actually, it's all just one system. The rock is being eroded by the water and the kind of grains of sand are mixing with it. And there's no hard boundary there. It's all just dissolving into each other. And that's what happens in inanimate kind of physical reality. But with life, what you have is, for a time while the system's alive, it resists that tendency towards decay and disorder. It doesn't do it perfectly, which is why we age and ultimately we die. And when we die, we kind of, blend and dissolve back into everything else at the same rate as non-living things, because we're not living at that point, obviously. But while we're alive, all living systems have to actively behave, actively do things to keep their form together. And so what I felt must be the case is that if something's kind of coming at you at your boundary, by the time it kind of hits you and disrupts your boundary, whether it's like, say, it's heat or it's a physical object or whatever, by the time it kind of disrupts you, it's too late. You can't survive that way. So what I found must be the case is, in order to exist, all living systems have to try to compute knowledge of the world around them. Knowledge of things that are at a distance. They're fundamentally unknowable because the system doesn't have direct contact with them, but it gets these sensory clues. And so even a single-celled organism, even a plant, every living thing, it can't just be inert and just stay there and through some kind of strength not wear away. It needs to be kind of computing a picture, a kind of simulation of the world around it, if it's going to survive. And so this is the kind of core idea, that we've been misled in thinking about consciousness as something specific to brains. Brains are associated with consciousness, absolutely. But what I'm arguing is what's going on is consciousness comes into existence with life. It's a fundamental aspect of the life process. And you could say its function is the life process. That's maybe putting it back to front. They're two sides of the same coin, is what I'm arguing. The physics of life generates an appearance of a world around you because you need to construct such a kind of to try to know the world around you, and you can't know it because it's at a distance. But also, the world doesn't actually have an appearance. Appearance is something that appears in consciousness. So there's another way you can think about the hard problem. Things like wavelengths of light. The wavelength is a quantity, and wavelengths of light don't have colors. Colors, when we're talking about color, we're talking about your conscious experience. Red apples aren't actually red out there in the world. They look different colors to different species depending on their visual systems. And that's not that there's some objective color and some of them are a bit off. It just genuinely doesn't have a color. Like, appearance doesn't exist out there in the world. And that's just almost a matter of definitions if we're going to be straight on what we're talking about with consciousness. So if you need to know what the world around you looks like, but it doesn't look like anything, what I'm arguing is that you need to conjure up this experience of a world. A simulation is a good analogy. So I wanted to kind of be a bit more precise than I'm being here by just waving my hands and talking about simulations and things. And I'm a neuroscientist. I don't specialize in the kind of statistical physics of early life forms. So I dug into the literature, and the first thing I came across was a book by Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist, and it's called What is Life? And towards the end of it, he lays out this definition of life, that to be alive is to basically resist the second law of thermodynamics for a time, and keep your order together. Now, I don't think I wholesale independently came up with this idea. I suspect because Schrödinger's had such a gigantic influence, I've heard people talk about the second law in ways that kind of implied this. So, but it made me feel like, okay, this isn't a crazy way to think about life. And then soon after, I came across a paper, and I was surprised that it was by a neuroscientist at the same university as me, Carl Friston, who's arguably the kind of most important living neuroscientist. And this was also on life. And this paper, it kind of showed mathematically aspects of the kind of physical side of things that I was intuiting. So what it kind of showed was, an aspect of the paper that was most relevant to me was that when you come up with mathematical descriptions for any process, it's like you're telling a story. You're kind of coming up with a model for what's going on. And there are a few different stories you can tell mathematically about exactly the same quantitative process, same physical process going on in a living system. And so he also started from this kind of Schrödinger idea that to be alive is to be keeping your form together, and explicitly kind of states it in terms of having a boundary that needs to be maintained, basically. And so you need to decouple your insides from the outside world. In this process is what I'm arguing is significant, is that's when insides come into existence, the possibility to have an internal perspective on the world. And so what in this paper, I think the paper's called Life as We Know It, if you want to look it up. What he shows is that one way to keep your form together is to minimize the kind of disorder in your boundary, which should make sense, right? If you're not doing that, you basically can't exist as a living system. You're going to get destroyed. So if you're going to exist, you need to be kind of behaving in such a way as to keep this boundary intact. And again, there's no magic here. Much like the second law, this is just something that is kind of like the theory of evolution. You can state it that if something exists as a living system, if it has a form, it must be keeping its form together actively. You couldn't find a living system that wasn't doing that, because all those ones would be dead. So it's similar kind of tautological logic that you see in Darwin's theory of natural selection. But I'm not saying that's an insult. I think I find these kind of theories really thrilling, where there's a kind of circular logic that just it proves it must be true. I think those are quite exciting ways of getting insight into the nature of the world. So what he shows is that you can look at the maths of how a living system keeps its kind of the entropy of its boundary minimized. This is kind of cast under something called the free energy principle, which he's written a lot about. But you can also look at exactly the same thing, and you can show that it's mathematically equivalent to the insides of the system doing something called Bayesian inference. And this is a branch of mathematics that's to do with kind of coming up with hypotheses, building up models, and testing them against evidence. And this was exactly the kind of mathematics that would kind of bear out my intuition that the physics of the living system, it's kind of acting in such a way as to attempt to compute knowledge of the world beyond. So this paper was all about just the physics of life, but it kind of inspired me. It made me feel like I was on the right track, and I could take this into fleshing out this pan-biological theory of consciousness that I'm sharing with you now. So what I felt I had to be more precise about was this intuition that the physical operation of the system, that it leads to it attempting to compute knowledge. Now, what do I mean by that more precisely? Well, as I said, you can't have knowledge of what the world around you looks like, or what its appearance is in any sensory modality, because it has no appearance. And so knowledge is a subcategory of belief. It's a true belief. And perception is inherently what we'd say non-veridical. To be veridical would be to be correct and true and accurate. And I'm saying that conscious perception is inherently it's like a hallucination. There's this idea of consciousness being like a controlled hallucination, where it's kind of controlled by checking it against the sensory evidence. And so it's a hallucination whose structure maps onto the relevant structure of the world. I'm arguing that the internal kind of patterns of consciousness match onto actual patterns in the world, but that the world isn't actually kind of red and blue and all these different sensory kind of qualities that we experience. So we can't have knowledge of the world, but we clearly believe things about the world. I don't mean this in terms of propositional, like having a statement and believing it's true or false, but when you behold a red apple, you believe that there is a red apple out there in the world. That's why it's so strange if I say to you, redness doesn't exist out there in the world, because we believe in redness, right? That's what it is to have this kind of conscious appearance of a world around you. We imbue it with a sense of reality. And so I think belief is a far more conservative way to talk about this than knowledge. We're talking about a system holding that the world is a certain way. Now, it's not doing this in terms of quantities, as we spoke about. The contents of consciousness are qualitative. So you can kind of describe consciousness in a system as having beliefs and qualities. If you have a kind of framework of beliefs and qualities, then you have an appearance of a world around you, and that's consciousness. That's what we're talking about. So, as a living system is living and kind of engaging in its survival behavior. Actually, let's use an example. Imagine early life. You've got some single-celled organisms at the bottom of the ocean, and there's a crack in the ocean floor, and there's molten rock coming out. Well, generation after generation, just through kind of random evolution, some of those kind of little single-celled organisms would wander over into the lava, and they would die. But some of them, by chance, would act in such a way as to move away from the lava when they detected the kind of kinetic energy radiating from it. Now, what's going on in that picture? Well, at the level of the kind of physical system, we have the behavior I described, where only the systems that act in such a way as to minimize the disorder survive. So if you wander over into lava, there's a kind of high entropy, that's like an area of high kinetic energy, a lot of movement, and that movement is disruptive to a system like ourselves, or a single-celled organism. And so the entropy is increased fatally in the system, the disorder, and it's no longer alive. So the ones that exist found a way to avoid the lava. Now, it's sensing this kind of high kinetic energy radiating towards it, and it has a way of detecting the direction that it's coming from. But the kind of molten rock has no intrinsic appearance, remember. It's just physical kind of stuff that has high kinetic energy. But the system, the single cells that are alive, they successfully navigate away from the molten rock. And so they seem to be holding that there's an area that's dangerous. I'm using the word dangerous here to mean it's not good for their survival. And they have a way of navigating around dangerous objects. So something seems to be going on physically inside the system that allows it to have this belief that the area over there is dangerous. But where do these beliefs, where do they exist? So you have the physical operation of the system. You have its physical states being arranged in certain ways. In us, this might be activity in our brains. In a single-celled organism, it might just be kind of reactions of molecules. But there's some physical arrangement that kind of instantiates information. And what I mean by information is that over and above the kind of physical arrangement, the physical arrangement is informative. It kind of indicates a possibility amongst a range of possibilities. And so in this case, you've got dangerous versus safe. You could have food versus not food. these are possibilities, that are defined with respect to the system. If the system eats it, that's what I'm calling food. If it doesn't eat it, then I'm saying it's not food from the perspective of the living system. And so at the level of information, it's entirely possible for a system to hold a range of different beliefs about the way the world could be. This is fundamentally coming from within the organism. It doesn't have to be the way that the world is, and I'm saying the world actually isn't any of these ways. But the system can generate a range of possibilities at the level of information that map onto the structure of the world. So, food versus not food, there's something going on there in the actual pattern of the world, even though food isn't, there's nothing intrinsic to food that makes it food. Food is a relative term depending on the system that's eating it. But if you take into account the system and if it can approach it, eat it, get nourishment from it and survive, all of those dynamics, I'm arguing, are getting condensed inside the system as this belief that that is food. And this exists at the level of information. And so if you just had a kind of one-dimensional world, then you wouldn't expect this to be anything like consciousness, anything like an appearance of a qualitative world. You might just expect it to be the physical dynamics of the system if it's just approach or move away from one thing. But the world around us is far richer in structure. The patterns in the world that are relevant to our survival are incredibly complex. And so you have all the physical stuff that exists in the world, but over and above that, you have what you could call statistical structure. Now, I'll unpack what I mean by that. If you take the area of molten rock, that has a high mean kinetic energy. But if you don't define the area and actually measure it and take the mean, then it only exists implicitly. It's implicit, it does exist, it's ready to be taken, it's part of the world. But this statistical feature, and by statistical I mean like a statistic, like a mean or a correlation, or these ways that we look at patterns in the world, that statistical structure exists implicitly. But when a living system comes along, it instantiates it explicitly inside the system as these beliefs in the kind of patterns of the world that are relevant to survival. So you take something like the molten rock being red hot, right? We say red hot because there's a correlation between the way that when there's an increase in kinetic energy, often there's a change in the profile or the kind of reflectance profile where you get preferentially reflected long wavelengths of light. So there's a whole structure of correlations here, right? That's a correlation. They vary together. As you increase the kinetic energy, you get preferentially reflected long wavelengths of light. And so there's this real structure out there in the world that's relevant to our survival. And living systems, I'm arguing, instantiate beliefs about this structure inside the system. So while the red hot surface isn't red or hot in terms of the qualities out there in the world, it just has high kinetic energy and reflects long wavelengths of light. The structure maps on successfully. Things that co-vary in this kind of internal representation, this internal belief space of consciousness, they co-vary in the statistical structure of the world. And so I'm saying living systems physically are extracting this and instantiating it as beliefs, and they're beliefs about the world outside, which is why consciousness appears around us. Philosophers talk about consciousness as having this property of intentionality, that the contents seem to be referring to a world outside of us. And this explains why that would be the case, especially since this thermodynamic picture is not one of the living system being fundamentally separate from the world around. You have to consider the environment and the living system together. And so you can see why there's this coupling of the internal kind of states of consciousness and the perceived, and the states of the structure of the world around that the system needs to consciously perceive. And I think it's actually the fact that we've lost this sense of this unity with the wider world. We fall into this illusion of separation, that we are truly separate from the world around us. And, we're actually a kind of pattern. As I mentioned at the start, we're made of the same stuff of reality, and our form changes over time, but day to day it stays roughly the same. And we exchange material with the world when we eat. And so we're constantly having this turnover of the kind of stuff that makes us up. So what we are really is a pattern that continues over time. but a pattern that in reality, a pattern that's fully embedded, in the stuff of the universe. And I think we have such a strong feeling of separation because you kind of, in this process of pulling away from the rest of the world and keeping your form together, it helps to be concerned with your separation. But I think in the case of consciousness, because the very systems that kind of fall into these illusions are the ones that are trying to investigate how consciousness relates to the world, I think that's why we've been kind of misdirected into looking for it in the human brain. That's one reason, but also the fact that the human brain is kind of intelligent enough and has language, so it's intelligent enough to communicate to us. We can all communicate to each other using it. And therefore we kind of, because it's conscious, we look at the fact that it's intelligent and has language. And a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking that intelligence, that complexity, that language must be required for consciousness, instead of seeing that it's kind of confounded with it. It's just because the system's talking to us, that's the one we focus on. We can't really study plant consciousness because it has no way of telling us it's conscious. This is a fundamental issue with thinking about what systems are conscious. Without a theory of consciousness, you just have to kind of go on your intuitions that things like you are conscious, and if plants don't resonate with you very much, you just assume they're not conscious. Although there are lots of people who are on board with the idea of plant consciousness, especially since if one experiences the fact that language and the concept of the self are not necessary for consciousness, as can be experienced in meditation or with psychedelics, then you kind of become very open to the idea that any living system could have consciousness, because you appreciate it to just be this space of phenomenal awareness, this space of these kind of qualities appearing, which seems absolutely possible for any living system to have. It's not intelligence. It's tied up with the kind of intelligence of life, but it's not intelligence in the way of our mental intelligence. It's not like I'm not saying that plants are thinking, that they're kind of capable of doing complex cognition or anything like that, or any level of cognition, but just that they have this appearance of a world around them as they try to resist thermodynamic equilibrium. And I think people have a real resistance to this. A lot of people do. And I think we're living in an age where humans are still subject to the same anthropocentric thinking that has characterized all of kind of the last 500 years of scientific development. With Copernicus and Galileo, people really didn't like the idea that we weren't at the center of the universe. There was just this kind of unconscious emotional need for humans to be the absolute center of the universe. And people didn't like it when the evidence suggested that actually we're not special. We're not at the center of the universe at all. And then you have Darwin. People really felt like it was kind of deeply immoral to suggest that we were not categorically different to the rest of nature, categorically different to other animals. And I think we're facing the same thing here. I think consciousness is the last holdout, where people really want consciousness to be this kind of special human thing that proves our specialness and proves that we're better than everything else, and proves the kind of that is worthwhile our sense of alienation and our sense of separation from the rest of the world, because it's what gives us this specialness. But it's really the same thing as the Darwinian worldview, where you realize there's just a continuum. And as I said at the start, the hardness of the hard problem was always that you couldn't say anything about brains in third person terms. The brain held separate from the rest of the world, and just imagining this as if it's an object that exists in its own right, and you try to map directly from kind of these neurons are active in the brain to here's your experience of red, and that was never going to work. I agree that you can't do that, but if you get rid of this idea of separation and you instead zoom out to the system and you think about you're not even thinking about a brain in a body and a body in an environment. You're getting rid of any sense of separation, and you're thinking there's the entire universe, and where in the evolution of the universe does privacy in the sense and this world building of consciousness come into existence? And from that perspective, I can't see any other time in the universe that consciousness could possibly pop into existence. When it's stated that it's impossible to think of a point in evolution that a light suddenly came on and that you go from blind mechanism to aware systems, I think that's right. I think you can't do that. I think that's because the most momentous kind of change in the physics of the universe was the moment life came to existence. And that is associated with this introduction of an entirely new kind of thing into the world that we call experience or consciousness. So just to close with the kind of basic idea, if all that talk of beliefs and qualities is too much detail, the fundamental idea is, if you're going to keep yourself together in a world that's falling apart, you need to try to know what's going on around you. And that's the kind of the basic idea. All living things need to attempt to know the world around them. They can't know it directly because it's inherently unknowable. So they construct this, what you can think of as like an internal simulation that kind of maps successfully onto the world, allows you to navigate it, gives you the impression that the world looks a certain way when it actually doesn't. And all life is equally conscious. We're not talking here about plants being a little bit conscious. You can get confused if you think about levels of consciousness, because consciousness is fundamentally this kind of binary thing. It either exists in a system or it doesn't. You can't have a little bit of a perspective in a system. If you take a perspective at all, there's a full-blown perspective there, a full-blown experience. And so actually another reason I think maybe people would resist this idea is it's quite dizzying when you suddenly start looking at insects around you and all the plants and just imagine they are having an experience as vivid as yours. That's entirely different, obviously. But that the universe is just, well, at least our planet, is absolutely full of conscious experiences that are all happening. It's not that it's all this blind matter and that we're alone as these kind of, the kind of guardians of the planet who are the only ones who are conscious, and maybe our dogs are, or something, is a way a lot of people think about this. But instead, all of nature is conscious. And actually, even within us, the kind of implications of this, of us as multicellular organisms, is that systems within us might be conscious as well. So the unconscious, I now think, is probably just differently conscious. There's the system in our brain that has our model of ourself and our language capacity, and that's the system I'm talking to you with now. But the systems that allow me to do what we call unconscious behavior, I now think they're probably absolutely conscious, but they're just inaccessible. We're kind of cobbled together from all these different evolutionary systems that are built on top of each other. And we're fundamentally, like a colony. We're like a superorganism. We are made of lots of single-celled organisms that got together in order to act together. And I think the weirdest thing is that I now suspect, or I actually think, that an individual cell in your body, a neuron in your brain, or a skin cell, has an experience of its environment as it resists thermodynamic equilibrium. And it's not thinking, it's not kind of reflecting on its place in the universe, but that there's a feeling out of kind of probably what we would think of as kind of pleasure and pain, in terms of things being aversive, moving away, behaving in such a way as to avoid destruction, versus behaving in such a way as to flourish, or at least keep your form together. And so this can be kind of overwhelming if you think in this way about how much consciousness, how many kind of islands of consciousness there might be out there in the world. And it also kind of strongly suggests that AI will never be conscious, at least as long as it's running on the same kinds of information processing systems we have today. And that's because if you look at a self-driving car, even if you programmed it with the same kind of mathematics I'm talking about here, it's not a kind of bounded, self-contained, self-creating system like life is. If the intelligence of a human can make a self-driving car, put all the kind of bits in place, program the computer, assemble all the pieces, but fundamentally it's like arranging dominoes and then setting them going. There's no inside and outside for the system to have a perspective. If you put on your kind of lenses of seeing the world as this thermodynamic kind of soup of things blending into each other, the car's going to rust. It's just going to kind of dissolve away. There is no inside and outside, but there is for us. And so you would be able to make a conscious machine if you made it, you could make it out of silicon, out of whatever, but as long as it showed these same kind of self-sustaining dynamics that life shows, then I would argue it would be conscious. But I don't think we want to, I at least don't think it's ethical to make conscious machines. So thank you for listening. I hope that was clear. I'll talk about this, I'm sure, a lot more. So send me any questions if any of it wasn't clear, or if you have anything else you want to run by me. I do regular Ask Me Anythings every 2 weeks for people who've kindly supported my work on Patreon, as I've been kind of moving out to the public sphere over the last year. So you can go there, Dr. James Cooke, at Patreon, or YouTube/Dr. James Cooke is also where I put up video versions of this podcast, which you may be watching now. And if you are, there's audio versions where you find your podcasts. Thank you for listening.